Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final keynote session. We'll give it some time for folks to roll in. We'll get started in a moment. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Feel free to say hi in the chat as we get up and loaded, or I'll just give it another about 10 seconds. People are still coming in. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to the final keynote session and the final session of the conference. We made it. And thank you all for being part of the fifth Calm. Couldn't do it without you all. I mean, the community is what makes this all happen. And we are so happy that you've been with us for the past 3 days and are joining us here for this final keynote that we're all very excited about. Some logistics, I think, are next, perhaps. Nope, this is a logistic, I suppose. This session is being recorded. So just keep that in mind as we move forward, and it will be available on YouTube shortly after the conference once we get everything organized and uploaded. And then some other logistics for today. So thank you to our keynote sponsor, the University of Missouri at Kansas City. We're very helpful for the Zoom room that you're providing for us. Please use the chat for general comments or any technical issues as you've been doing throughout the conference. And then please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom for questions for the presenters. You might get redirected if you put it in the chat. Don't worry about it. We'll just ask you to put it over in the Q&A. Captions. This session is being live captioned. Thank you to Marshall for your support with that. And so you can use those with the streaming link that I believe Shanti will be dropping. Thank you, Shanti. A reminder that we have some collaborative resource sharing space that's Zotero. And I believe that will be also linked in the chat shortly. Feel free to add anything there if you haven't already. That seems applicable to the conversation and might be widely appealing to those attending the session. And then finally, please continue to abide by our code of conduct, which is being dropped in the chat right now. Thank you, Shanti. As far as I know, there has been no reports of any code of conduct violations, and that is amazing. And thanks to everyone in the community for following it. And let's keep it going for this final session. And so I'm going to hand it over now to, I believe, Danny, who's going to give us a quick snapshot of the week we've had so far.
All right, thanks, Moya. So one of the things that we have always done in our closing session is do a little bit of reflecting about the week and what we've learned and who we've been in community with. So here's a quick summary. So we had our first keynote with Meredith Farkas, and we're about to have our closing keynote with Silvia Vong. So we're really excited about that. We had 28 conference sessions, and that ranged from folks who are individual contributors, who are taking leadership roles formally or informally, middle managers, administrators, et cetera. One of the things that we noticed this year that was really interesting is that there were several presentations which included two or more people who had institutional reporting relationships talking about that relationship development, conflict, et cetera. And that was really interesting to see. And we're really grateful to those folks for sharing vulnerably about those topics of conversation. I don't know that I've ever seen that before, so I just wanted to call that out as something really interesting and helpful to see. Our Q&A and chat windows popping per always. Imagine that will continue in this session. So thank you all for being so engaged in the Calm content. We'll have a total of over 21 hours of recorded session content. That content will go up in the next few weeks. So for the opening and closing keynote sessions that are professionally captioned, we'll get those up sooner rather than later. And then the rest we'll need to do some quality assurance on before we put those up. So thanks for bearing with us. As of right now, we've got about 20 resources in the Calm Zotero and invite you to add more as you think of them, or once you're done with the conference week and have some time to actually contribute there. We have a lot going on our social media pages as well, so we hope to continue the conversation there. So over 400 folks on Blue Sky. That has become our alternative to Twitter, which used to be the most active for Calm. So we invite you to join us there. Our Discord has gotten quite large. There's over 640 members now. We even added a new channel yesterday called #Parents of Calm after a session about moms in leadership. So definitely invite you to join some of those channels there. And that Discord does stay up around the year. So it doesn't have to be just on the conference time. We do have about 700 people in our LinkedIn group. It's a great place for you to post different opportunities for folks in the Calm community. And then our Instagram has about 400 folks. And we're always happy to see you there too. And shout out to our communications committee who has done an incredible job in managing all of these different platforms. And they made individual images for each of our sessions this year, which was really special, I think, for all the folks who presented. So thank you all. One of the things that we like to do is think about some of the themes that emerged through the week, things that stuck with us, things we saw in multiple presentations, and we'd like to invite you to do the same. So you're welcome to share in the chat, and we'll just share a few of the things that we as the steering committee identified. So starting with our first keynote, and then carrying through a variety of other sessions, this idea that there are no bibliographic emergencies, that we do important work, and most of it does not have to happen on a specific time frame. That being said, there are library emergencies, and some of us I know have even dealt with them during this week, but bibliographic emergencies is something we should not believe in, perhaps. We're in community together. We heard in a lot of different presentations about the importance of having community, having other folks in management positions, either within or outside your institution to talk with, and that being an area where we hope we might see more of that across our community developing with intentionality. Calling back to some of those supervisor-supervisee relationship presentations, hard situations are better if we're committed to the relationship. We also heard about folks who make sure that they develop one-to-one relationships with their supervisees or managers, because it makes it more possible to have those difficult conversations in the future if you're committed to having that relationship and have built a relationship ahead of time. One of the great things about the sessions that we saw this week is having these open spaces to talk about some of the specifics of what we're dealing with. It helps us feel like we're not alone. It helps others learn from some of those specifics, so that when they encounter them themselves, they have some ideas for how they might deal with them. And being able to have that space together has been really helpful. We heard a lot about difficult conversations, conflict, et cetera, as continuing to be really challenging spaces for managers. I did see a comment today that someone said, we talk about this all the time, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it's getting better. And so some of our presentations this week talked about how our feminized, but not necessarily feminist profession could undermine our ability to have those difficult conversations. And we should think about how we could help folks learn those skills. Middle managers can implement policies in ways that are kind. So similarly, managers might have agency in how they implement those policies, even when it doesn't feel like you have the most power. But we should take advantage of that power when we can, and be able to implement policies and interpret policies in ways that benefit the folks that we work with when we can. One thing that we heard in multiple presentations this week is library administrators are also middle managers, or as I like to say, everybody's got a boss. So what does that mean? Again, what does that mean for our agency? Where are those areas where you can make individual decisions that are the most supportive to the folks that you work with? And then finally, kind of a meta comment, we saw a lot of great documentation from our presenters. And then for our conference itself, we had a lot of documentation after 5 of these. So documentation, we love it. We're librarians. we should all strive to be great at it. So great documentation helps us all. So really would love to hear some of the themes that you noticed in the chat as well. I see a couple coming in so far, and feel free to keep adding those during our opening here. And I'm going to turn it now over to Heather to talk about Beyond a Land Acknowledgement.
Great, thank you. So first and foremost, a huge thank you to our Conference Experience Committee who did the work around the Code of Conduct and also the Beyond a Land Acknowledgement to keep this work alive and to keep all of us engaging with it inside of our community, which gives us space for mutual support and mutual accountability as we engage around this, knowing that we're all at different paths on this journey, points of our path on this journey, and that we're all showing commitment just by showing up around it. We had over 100 attendees at the Beyond a Land Acknowledgement session. And so thank you to everyone who came. We talked about in the revision and continued editing of the Beyond a Land Acknowledgement language for CALM, the continued action possibilities. So for the 2026 conference, the committee has recommended and is encouraging attendees to spend time continuing to learn about the present and historical stewards of the land on which you live or work. We are all physical human beings, even though this is a virtual conference. Please refer to the Native Land Digital and the Native Governance Center resources if you are looking for places to start in engaging with learning about where you are and other historical information. We invite attendees also to identify Indigenous organizations in your actual physical community and donate to them in lieu of paying a conference registration fee if that is available to you. That donation might be one step in a larger process of taking action to support Indigenous people and nations. During the Beyond a Land Acknowledgement session, some of the preliminary themes that came out into the Padlet where we were all sharing is that this work is complicated, but staying committed is really key, that it is the perseverance and the intention that will put us in a good direction to make meaningful impact. It was really clear from our community that concrete actions are desired. We do want guidance around what specific actions we might be able to take. It's not always clear, and the work, as noted previously, is complicated. So being committed to relationship, one of the themes from the slide that Danny shared about the whole conference, feels connected here as well. If we're in relationship and we're listening and being committed to that, we tend to find actions that contribute to the impacts that we're hoping to create. The video, the TEDx that was shared during the session for Beyond a Land Acknowledgement also really did a beautiful framing. The speaker did a beautiful framing of how this is everyone's work. And in the conversation we talked about in many of the rooms that that's an invitation for all of us, that the benefit that comes from decolonizing is actually a benefit for all of us. So please keep adding ideas. And if you were not able to attend the session, please feel welcome to open the Padlet and look through some of what's been shared there. The resources also are linked and are being added to the Zoteros and are available on the Beyond a Land Acknowledgement page of the Calm Conference website. So thank you again, and look for more of this work in the future Calms to come. And now I will pass to, oh wait, no, to me. I will pass to me, sorry. Related to the whole conference, please know that you will be getting a survey at the end of the conference. So in addition to the surveys that you filled out, the feedback forms on each of the sessions that you attended, and thank you very much because that feedback is shared directly to those presenters, please tell us about your feedback on the conference overall. We really care about it. You will get an email automatically with the details of the survey. We listen to it and read it and go over it every year of all the previous columns, and we'll do it again this year. It helps us shape how we do this work going forward. And if you were at the IMLS grant session and you want to put in thoughts about how the conference and the work of Calm holistically could be envisioned, sure, we would love that too. That would be great. We're looking for ideas of all kinds. We love it if you tell us nice things. That's okay to do, but also We're happy to hear suggestions. And if there's any feedback that you have for us about how to make it better, right, that we're here to hear that as well. Please do, however, through all feedbacks, remember that there are real humans who will read that feedback. And so our code of conduct is in place when we're thinking about how you give final feedback as well. And please, if you didn't already, fill out the specific session feedbacks for the presenters in SCED. Okay, now I will pass to Veronica.
Thanks, Heather. So if, like me, you are feeling revitalized by this conference and sad and heartbroken that it's ending, we just want you to know that COM will be returning in 2028. So do know that we are coming back, looking forward to even more wonderful presentations and continuing to build this really fantastic community. And in the meantime, we want to suggest that you stay in touch with COM by joining our mailing list on the COM website. And I believe we can put a link to that in the chat as well. And I know that 2028 can seem like a long time away. It really isn't. But the mailing list will allow you to stay in touch with us and stay tuned for other related events that might be happening between now and the 2028 conference. And I'll pass it on to David.
Hi, everybody. I have the great task of being able to thank the 3 groups that made COM possible this year. And the first is to thank all of our amazing presenters from the 3 days of the conference. Hope you'll join me in congratulating them all. Thank you all for your time, for your expertise, and for your ideas. Every year, and I know the rest of steering, I know the rest of us are always blown away by the quality of presentations throughout the conference. I've learned a lot. I know you all have too. Of course, this conference also wouldn't be possible without our wonderful reviewers, who I'll be thanking in a moment as well, who gave their time to read through proposals. But thank you to all of our presenters and keynote presenters, including Silvia, who is upcoming and I'm very excited about. All right, keep that applause going for our next group, which is the COM Volunteers. COM is a volunteer-run conference, so everybody who's involved in planning and running COM during the days of the conference is not getting paid. We're all donating our time and our energy. I'm going to go through each committee briefly and thank each one for their work. So the first committee that I'll thank is the steering committee, which handles the big picture planning for the conference and offers guidance and support to all of the committees. Program planning reviews and approves conference session proposals and helps moderate sessions during the conference. Our technology committee sets up Zoom, leads tech training for presenters, and provides technical support throughout the conference. You've seen them throughout the conference in the chat, sharing links as well. The logistics committee configured SCED and set up the overall conference schedule and tracks and coordinated registration. Our communications committee, as was said earlier, runs all of our social media. They've been putting in a lot of work to make those custom graphics. And our conference experience committee focuses on creating an inclusive, welcoming, and supportive experience through the code of conduct and beyond a land acknowledgement. Our final side of volunteers thanks all of our reviewers by name. It takes a village to do a lot of things. It takes a village to make COM happen. Thank you all so much again for your time, for your energy, making sure that this conference was able to be a success. Okay, I have one last group to thank, which is our sponsors. So we are so thrilled to be able to offer COM for free to all attendees, and our sponsors made that possible. This year's conference cost $10,000 to put on, and in exchange for their sponsorship, these organizations received some guaranteed registration slots for attendees. And I also want to share that while we welcome attendance from all people who are interested in COM, regardless of where they work, COM is really pleased to share that we do not take sponsorships from any vendors, publishers, or corporations. COM is by library workers for library workers. And to ensure that we maintain this commitment, we are sponsored exclusively by academic libraries, library membership groups, and library consortia. So I'm going to thank our sponsors by name. Keep that applause going. The first is the Medical University of South Carolina Libraries, who are our sponsors for SCED. We have the University of Missouri, Kansas City for being our Zoom sponsor. University of Nevada, Las Vegas, who is our accessibility sponsor, including live captioning. Then I have a large group of sponsors to thank for being our keynote sponsors. That's Binghamton University, Duke University, Xavier University of Louisiana, MIT, Weber State University, the University of Wyoming, George Mason University, and the Massachusetts Commonwealth Consortium of Libraries and Public Higher Education Institutions. Thanks to all of you for making the keynote possible. One final sponsor to thank is the University of California, San Diego, who provides a lot of back of house support for the conference. They do our financial and administrative support that makes this conference run. We couldn't do it without you all. My last slide is a reminder for all of you that if you didn't see your institution on that list, or you did, and you want to make sure that their support continues, please reach out to us at the Calm email, calmconf@gmail.com. And just as a reminder, if you are here from a publisher, a vendor, or another corporation, you are welcome here. We just won't take any sponsorships from your employer. Okay, now I'm going to pass it to the most important part of today's presentation, which is Danny to talk about the pets of Calm.
Thank you, David. I'm so excited to get to share with you all of the amazing pets of calm that we received. So we received about 80 photos of amazing pets. And before I get into it, I do want to share a little bit about why we do this. So it's our 5th conference, and harking back to our very first conference in 2021, we had an amazing presenter, Steve Borelli, who presented with his dog, who you're going to see in just a moment. This is Winston, the original pet of Calm. You can see screenshots of Winston during the presentation. So you can see why Pets of Calm had to be a thing that happened. I feel like this is emblematic of trying to bring our whole authentic selves to this conference, of being accepting of everyone where they're at. Like, we love pets. It's like a little weird to put up pictures of people's kids, so we don't do that. But wherever you're at, however you are, we're glad that you're here with us. So yeah, Winston, we love you. And thanks for making this a thing for us. And thank you, Steve, for sharing Winston with us all the way back in 2021. So here are the pets from this year. Page 1 of 3. I would love to give a shout out to some of the pets on this page, but they are all amazing. I would love to show you all. I hope you can see Peony, who is looking so comfy. We've got Vincent Van Dog, an amazing name. I think on this page, we also have Paco, our honorary member of our technology committee. Paco is running the show behind the scenes. Y'all don't even know. Let's see, Tootsie, who I think looks like Ron Swanson from Parks and Recreation, like extremely serious. But we love all these pets. So we'll give one more minute. If you see your pet there, I hope that you see your pet being appreciated here together. And then we're going to move on to the second page. Oh yes, and a guinea pig of calm. I think that's a first. Okay, more amazing pets. I also want to note that while we had over 80 submissions of pet photos, none of them had the same name. So amazing job being creative pet namers in your own homes. Yeah, sadly, we didn't get a goat this year, but we do have the greatest of all time, Winston. But all of your pets are the greatest of all time. So love this cat noodles. I see someone also mentions that. We've got Fitzwilliam Darcy, the Dalmatian, is here. Moonlight, who is the most excited doodle I have ever seen in my life. And there are some real excited doodles out there. So shout out to Moonlight. Freya here has amazing whiskers. We've got a bunny. We've got lots of beautiful black cats. I also have a black cat, so I do really love to see all that. Yes, the bunny. We've got Jasper and Chonk. These are these friends right here. You can maybe see why Chonk is named Chonk. And so many sleepy puppies and kitties. I'm glad to see that they're relaxing. They deserve it. All right, one more minute to look at these, and then we'll move on to our final, last but not least, pets of calm. Okay, even more pets of calm. Check out Phoenix, who is a frog. Incredible. April has on a life jacket, is being safe. We love April. We have Hector, or maybe Sarpedon. I'm actually not sure which is which, so sorry about that, Livia, but they are an Italian cat. They live in Italy. They're on an Italian porch right now. We've got Mila, who is this super fluffy kitty right here. We've got Chi Chi the Beagle, which is a great name. Yeah, I hope you see and love your pets along with us. I'm so sorry that I didn't get a chance to look up the name of this cat who was sitting like a human. Incredible cat. Love that cat. We should do a ratio of cats to dogs. It's looking pretty equal to me, but this is a good research question for us. Perhaps our next project. Thank you for letting us share your pets with the rest of the community. Thank you for sharing your pets with us. This is my favorite part. So glad to be able to do this together. And with all that good pet feeling, we are going to move into our final presentation, our keynote presentation, and I will hand it over to Tarita to do the introduction.
Great. Oh my gosh, I just realized, how does one follow that? No pressure, right? But I'm so pleased to be able to introduce our closing keynote speaker, Silvia Vong. Silvia is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto. She's a former academic librarian of 15 years with experience as an administrator and middle manager. Silvia's research areas are related to management as well as the library as a workplace, and now teaches a leadership course for future librarians. And if you haven't come across it yet, or even if you have, I'm going to drop in the chat. Silvia was also the editor of a Library Juice Press volume, Critical Management Studies in Librarianship, which will also be going into the Zotero unless somebody beats me to that. And speaking more personally, if you ever have the opportunity to work on a project or committee with Silvia, to learn from her from one of her classes, or just to simply share space with her, you can be assured that you're going to be in great company. She's a wonderful colleague and thought partner and just a lovely human being. And through both her scholarship and just who she is, embodies so much of the tenets of Calm. We're all just so thrilled to have you here, Silvia, as our closing keynote. And with that, I will hand over the virtual mic and stage over to you.
Thank you, Tarita. Actually, I'm the lucky one that I get to work with so many amazing people like you. So it's all everybody else. It's not me. I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to speak with everyone today, and hopefully we're going to do a bit of collective theorizing at today's session or closing keynote. So when I was thinking about my time as a manager in middle and in library administration, I kept thinking, what was the big challenge and kind of thing that I wish I knew at the start of my career. And one of those things was learning to lead with communities. And that was the hardest lesson that I had to learn, was that often I was taught in library school and in training institutes that leading was about confidence, it was about me, it was about the library. And I was really humbled over the years. And I came across Bell Hook's work in my kind of pursuit of my master's in education and later my PhD. Bell Hooks, I kept revisiting her work, which really incredibly important work. And I kind of reflected back on this idea of leadership, drawing in on Bell Hook's work, that idea of humility and many other things. So for today, I would love for us to theorize what community-led leadership, library leadership is for us. And I think theorizing is a really important exercise. A lot of my students will sort of say, Sylvia, theory is just so abstract. It doesn't make sense. It's just sort of these really like big assumptions, right? And what does it mean in practice? Like we want to learn how to, catalog materials. We want to learn how to use the latest AI technologies. These are some of the things I often hear, and I often kind of like chat with my students. I'm like, theory actually has a huge value in our communities because theory, even though it seems like it's this fog, so this is the Cumberland Gap, which is the border between Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. There's this fog kind of like covering this forest, right? it feels uncertain and it feels confusing, and there's this kind of fear of unknown, right? This theory is kind of like, what does this all mean? And I like to make the argument that that uncertainty is part of the process of hope, that we have to make sense of this kind of fog, right? And in fact, fog, if you think about it, has a purpose. It contributes to climate control. It helps retain humidity and moisture in forests. There's a value to that fogginess, and that we need to sit in it and be comfortable in it. And eventually that fog will clear. I like this quote. This is from Teaching to Transgress by Bell Hooks on page 70. Bell Hooks writes, "To me, this theory emerges from concrete, from my efforts to make sense of everyday life experiences, from my efforts to intervene critically in my life and the lives of others." I think this idea is really important, that Bell Hooks sort of touches on, is that theory isn't actually abstract. It's actually very concrete. Because when we theorize together as a community, we bring ourselves, we bring our perspectives, and we try to imagine a way forward collectively. And this act of theorizing is almost like a community conversation, right? What does this all mean? How do we move forward? And that's really important in our work, because as librarians, we work with different communities in the library world and outside of the library world. Now, the idea of community-led and community-based practice, that's not new. It's been around for quite some time. And if you, if you know of the Indigenous ways of knowing and wisdoms around that, community is centered in a lot of, different practices and approaches within different Indigenous nations and communities. And in kind of the Western research and pedagogy world, we have names now for different ways of doing community work. So in pedagogy, we talk about community engaged learning. So that means working with communities and putting students in those spaces and learning together. For example, one thing I'm exploring is looking at how I can teach my information literacy course in a long-term care home where elders and students share and work on like AI literacy and what that means, and having conversations and learning from one another in those spaces. And then we have research where there's a lot of different kind of frameworks for community-based research. A lot of this is centered around community-led work. So often in research, we design assuming that there's a problem or assuming this deficit kind of narrative, but with a community-based approach, we don't go in with assumptions. We go in open to learning and listening and working with the different groups and communities to explore or think about or find an answer to something or respond to a community need. In professional practice, we have communities of practice, which we all know about. We form our groups, and for this conference, it certainly feels like a larger community that we have here. So that idea of community within our profession is very much ingrained in our practice. And there's also asset-based community-led development. This is kind of an idea that they teach in some of the public library courses at our university. And the idea is that you kind of assume that communities have this asset, this strength. We're just working with them to amplify their strengths to address like a community need or community question. And finally, there's also community leadership. This is more grassroots. A lot of the literature talks about activism within the communities. So in community leadership, this is, citizen-led. And so there's no formalized role. Everyone is a leader within that group, and everybody works collectively towards something, whether it be advocacy or actionable change. And we have like a spectrum of different approaches. They can range from, community owned, which means that the community owns the project, that you are, there to act as a support, to the other end, which is community informed, where the community is more of a consultative kind of relationship. And in between, you have kind of ranges of, training community members to code data so that you're all coding data together, or you're working with the community to shape a curriculum or to talk about a program design. So there's a variety of different ways. And I can get into the nitty-gritty, the logistics of it. There's tons of frameworks that I've been studying and learning about. But I actually want to talk a little bit about something else. I want to sort of talk about theorizing what this would mean for us as library leaders. So, what does community-led library leadership, how can we theorize that? So when I think about sort of theorizing community-led library leadership and what that means in praxis, so that's theory and practice combined, I want to start with theory. Like, where do we begin in thinking about community-led library leadership? What are the concepts that are going to ground us in our practice and how we think about our work? And I think that's an important starting point before we move to practice, right? We're so quick to move to action that we kind of leave out this part of, again, sitting in that fog and making sense of things before we move to action. So I'm going to share some kind of my ideas. And now I don't think this is what it is, but I'm just sort of, this is the starting point. And eventually at the end, you're going to have an opportunity to contribute your ideas. I love interaction. I know keynotes typically it's a very much I speak at you, but I love the idea of theorizing together and collectively. So at the end, we're going to kind of try to theorize and bring more ideas together of what concepts and what actions would link to these concepts when we talk about community-led library leadership. So for me, it all kind of is grounded in these four things: values, stories, connection, and love. When I say love, I don't mean romantic love or familial love, but a much more complex form of love that bell hooks describes, which I'll get into detail. But I'm going to start with values because I think that's an important grounding when we think about conceptually what does community-led library leadership, if it were to have values, what would they be? So when I think about, and I'm going to draw a bit of my own personal experience and storytelling to kind of like work through the fog here. But when I think about values, we have some turtles here. I love the pets in the beginning because yeah, totally perfect. I have some turtles here, and actually turtles are very social. In some research studies, they talk about turtles actually socialize not just for food or for shelter, but actually they just like socializing. And I love that idea that, it's not just a kind of transactional relationship, right? But here, I think for values, what grounds me is in this idea that um, we are working together and bound in a way that is a community that is very much centered in community and people. So ethically, we're centering the groups that we're working with. And we often talk about library values and they always kind of lead back to the library. But I think here we can reimagine something different that's more community centric, something that brings us all together. And I had to learn the hard way what this meant for me. I always sort of navigated my career initially as a liaison librarian and then later early in my middle management career that I'm supposed to sell the value of a library, that I'm going into different groups and my university and all the different communities and trying to sell them, quote unquote, sell them the idea of the value of the library. And I always failed to struggle to get uptake. And I was like, why are people saying no to me? Or why is this is just not really landing right for some reason. And over the years, as I was having a conversation, I think it was in a role, and we were talking about journals, access to journals, and we were trying to get graduate students more engaged with, publishing and starting student journals as well. And I was a liaison librarian, sort of heading into management at the time. And I remember sitting down with the graduate students and like, like this is going to help your career. You should publish or start these journals, kind of selling them, the library product, quote unquote, of the platform and the librarian support. And there's just silence in the room. And I thought, oh, did I say something wrong or did I do something wrong? And very kindly, a couple of the graduate students hung back and chatted with me and said, Sylvia, we really appreciate this, but it doesn't really speak to our realities. Like we are experiencing a much different experience that, telling us to, do all this extra work is something that we can't sustain. The APCs and the cost of living in Toronto with the open access kind of push from the university is placing great pressure. And, we just really wish there was more support in what we needed, that what we wanted. And I thought, oh my goodness, you're right. Like I've been talking about the library, like as if I'm talking about myself this whole time, and I should be asking questions. I should be engaging in a kind of theorizing in learning about what their needs are, what they want, or what they valued in their work. So if I were to say values as a kind of concept, I think divining and rooting our practice in ethical and people-centered values is really important. And the community-led and defining values and priorities through with the community rather than assuming for the community, right? And I think that was the big lesson that I took away from that. And then when we get no from a group, maybe take that time to sit in that fog and do a reverse and shift. I call this is what I teach my students is the reverse and shift our gaze. So this is it's an idea around, it's from like a variety of different disciplines. You can say art history, geography, lots of different fields talk about reversing the gaze. So reversing the gaze is turning the gaze back to self, right? And then so reflecting on, am I, you know, aligning or supporting or learning from these communities what their values are. And then, being open and being, having humility in that conversation. And then I also like to add to shift our gaze because it's not just about ourselves, it's about our profession, our institutions. We're shifting our gaze towards the environment. How are our policies reproducing things? How are we contributing to the same practice that is, creating barriers for our community members? So I'd also like to talk about stories as a concept for community-led leadership. So, interestingly, my mom was telling me the other day, she said, you know, if birds in Chinese culture, at least in our kind of family, because China is very large and there's many subcultures around there, but one of the ideas my mother said was, birds, they talk. There's a network and they represent like a talking kind of network. And she said, hey, by the way, get rid of all the bird photos in your house because it means people are talking about you. Like, mom, chill. But I like the idea that, birds are this kind of network of stories, of sharing, of chatter and song. If you think about the birds, you look out, you're like, wow, like they're all just singing something, they're communicating. And those stories are really important because they really ground us in the kind of experiences, the nuance that people have, different groups and communities experience things, right? When we rely too much on quantitative things or numbers, we lose that background, that context that's really important in telling us what do our communities need. And those stories, that story sharing is a kind of theorizing, right? When we begin to share our stories, we begin to theorize. We begin to think about our stories and link our stories. Think of when you hear about somebody sharing a story, you might go, oh yeah, I experienced something similar, or something you said reminded me of something. That is theory linking together. So stories are so incredibly important and impactful. And we need more of it in a kind of community-led library leadership practice. We need to kind of sort of utilize more use of narrative inquiry in our practice. So what I would like to sort of theorize here is that, part of humility is listening to stories of, members of different groups, of communities, but also trust as an intersection of that. Because of course, the honesty and authenticity in the stories is reliant on, trust and building that relationship with one another. And I'd like to also point there are many narrative related methods that we should be learning more about in library leadership education. There's community dialogue, photo voice, where you have people take photos and, kind of tell their stories through those images. Participatory art making, to kind of imagine something and build meaning together. And story circles. This is one that I recently trained with Dr. Judy Pryor Ramirez, who uses this as kind of a data collection for social change. And so in this kind of practice, you sit around in a circle and you kind of create boundaries, and everybody has a voice in that circle, and they share a story based on prompts, and you theorize how to move forward. What are the actions we need for our community based on the stories that we've just heard? So that's an important kind of theorizing act, right? All of this is kind of a way to imagine a future with a community. Another idea that I'd like to bring up in kind of a concept, which I think is important in community-led library leadership, is connection. And I think this is in part the researcher in me that is an institutional ethnographer of sorts. I see the connections in the way that policies, people, institutions, they are all interconnected. And I think it's important to think about that and in our practice, not just for the library that's situated here, that we are leading the library. Rather, we are leading together with our communities and surrounding connected communities. And how do we make those connections with one another? And how do we understand and theorize what that connection is together? I'm going to share a story of something that I experienced. I was a middle manager at a library and I was public facing at the time. And so, our at the time we were experiencing higher numbers of incidents that were being reported by students, by faculty, and it was people experiencing homelessness who were entering the library more. And at the time, I was also volunteering at a nearby, like it was the campus church, and they had a multi-faith out of the cold program. And so that means they just, even though the church kind of organizes it, everybody from every faith is welcome to volunteer and join and support and help. And so I was volunteering in the mornings before I headed into work because it was very close by and I wanted to do some volunteer work. I like to do volunteer work on the side. And I remember sort of we were going through everything at the library, but I was also volunteering here. So we were making breakfast and lunches for people who needed food. And so I was working with the coordinator, and we usually just kind of have morning chats as we're kind of making breakfast for folks coming in. And the coordinator was talking about, there's this rise in this need, and they were running out of food. They didn't have a budget for food, and that they were really struggling to meet the needs of the higher demand for access to breakfast and lunch for the program. And as longer I kind of volunteered there, I actually started to recognize the same people in the library who were coming, having a meal in the morning, and then coming to the library for, just to sit there, read a book, rest, anything, right? And I thought, wow, like, instead of framing this as like a problem of this othering of this group, actually, this is a community. This is a community thing that we need to talk about, that we need to connect with one another and find a way forward. And so this image that I have is a food share. It's a program in Ontario where you can, and some universities do it across in the GTA area, but you can purchase food from the food terminal. So we have a food terminal in our province, and it's at cost. And so Food Share purchases the food at cost, and its condition is you cannot sell the food for profit, that you must then buy the food at the cost, and then sell the food at the same cost. So there's no profit making. It is about making food accessible. And part of the condition is that any food that you don't sell within your library or institution or organization, you have to donate and work in partnership with an organization. And so I remember contacting the coordinator of the Out of the Cold program, and I said, "Oh my goodness, hey, I just went to this session and I learned about this food share program. Would this help support your program? And how, at the library, we could also support some of our students who are also reporting higher costs of living. And so we would be able to sell fruits and vegetables to our students at cost, and so that way everyone as a community is benefiting from this program." And the person said, "Oh my goodness, yes, absolutely." So I was able to put together a proposal, get support from the institution, and we did a good food market. Here on the right there's like an Instagram post. I've blocked out the institution's name, but we did a good food market, and we sold whatever food we sold to students and people who needed it, because it was open to communities as well in the surrounding area. Everything that wasn't sold was donated to this program. So I think part of this kind of theorizing, this kind of conversations I was having with different people, with the Out of the Cold program, I remember talking to the volunteers like, "Oh, people just want a place to rest their heads, eat, do all these things without judgment." And I thought this was an important act, like theorizing it and learning from each other and finding a way forward. So for me, connection and its meaning is not centering the library and framing everything as everything else or the other, but connecting us together. How should we move together? How can we find a way to move together? And I think that also is kind of going back to the idea of exercising this kind of systems linking approach to our practice and work, that we're not just this library world, we are connected to a multitude of different worlds, and we all impact each other in certain ways. And also, more importantly, moving away from that capitalist mindset of time. I think that's part of the connection piece, right? Is taking time to learn and build those connections, or even learn about those connections, because those connections might already be there and we just don't notice it. And so taking that time is really, really important. And then transactional relationships, moving away from that. This idea that, well, you need to benefit and I need to benefit. Rather, we should think, how does this, again, linking back to our values, how does this link back to our values, and how does this link back to the stories that we learn from one another? This one's my favorite one. This one is bell hooks love. This idea of love. Um, and this is in teaching community. So there's two books that I often refer to after every term I teach. I actually read a lot of bell hooks to kind of like reflect and think about my teaching. Teaching to Transgress and Teaching Community are the two texts I often revisit, because students are community to me, are my community to me. Um, but this idea of love, so love is, as bell hooks write, this is in Teaching Community, page 134. Bell hooks describes love is powerful way to ground our actions. Love is a mutual practice of partnership rooted in care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect, and trust. So when we love, these all come into our practice. When we love, we are responsible. We hold each other responsible to one another. We are committed to one another. We act with care. We trust each other. We respect each other. These are the kind of groundings of what love is, in the way that Bell Hooks frames it. And that's really important, as a practice. And I think conceptually, if we think of community-led library leadership, I know saying love is a kind of strange thing to say in a meeting, but we could reframe it or we could rename it. But for me, I think love is a powerful, powerful concept. So this is where I learned about love. So I was a librarian doing liaison work, I think, at the time, and I was also running and leading different programs, co-curricular programs. And one of the things I was doing was zines. I love zines because I feel like it's a powerful way to express yourself. And I had received some grants for a 2-year kind of program for zine making. And at the time, the institution said, oh, there's accountabilities for the funding that you get. So you're going to have to report numbers. You also have to have an approved curriculum, which I had to submit, and they went over it. And so a lot of the kind of the program was focused on teaching students about zine as a medium, the history of it, and as well as kind of designing and creating these zines, right? And I think I grounded it in scholarship as conversation or something in my proposal. And so I got the funds. And so one of the components of it was I wanted to reach out to the different zine libraries that were in the city area. And Toronto Zine Library was one I was very aware of. And I had been in conversation and building a relationship over a few months at that time with somebody there because I was interested in kind of inviting somebody from the Toronto Zine Library to talk in one of my classes. And I met this wonderful person who volunteered there, and they kind of said, yeah, like I can do a bit of like a history of Dean, chat, and they would get an honorarium for their time. And so we had a bunch of students from the Book and Media Studies program, and they kind of joined up, and so they knew what the kind of program was about, so they were kind of expecting this history lesson. And they would get like a credit for attending this co-curricular activity. And so as this was going on, we actually had strikes happening on our campus, labor strikes. And so teaching assistants and QP workers, they were all on strike for working conditions, fair pay, a lot of different issues. And this was in a way also, I think at the time, a lot of the students were also kind of nervous because there was the potential of not having exams, or they weren't sure what was going to happen with their grades and grading and finishing and graduating on time. So all of this was happening as the zine library was happening, right? And the students, I think one of the students, it actually was one of the students who started sort of sharing their frustration. And it was just a casual conversation. It was our usual meetup. We were all meeting and having a conversation. And the student kind of expressed like stress, like I don't know what's gonna happen. I feel torn, like I really want to graduate because I can't pay for more. I'm already in debt for going back to school. So, the strike is really impacting me. And not that they were saying, I understand where they're coming from, but I just feel like it's personally affecting me. And, I could have kind of in that moment said, okay, well, we have a curriculum here. Let's move on. We're going to talk about the history of zine some more. But I remember just glancing over at the Toronto Zine Library volunteer, and we just kind of looked at each other and said, you know what? Let's talk about this. Let's use this space and let's have a conversation and let's support each other and let's try to learn from this. And so, and because the Toronto Zine Library volunteer also was an activist, like they were doing grassroots work on the side as well, she was like, this is a perfect conversation. And it actually links up to the idea of zines. And so we opened it up, and the students started sharing their insights with no judgment. We kind of came through the conversation with love and care and respect, understanding that everybody's lives were, challenging. And what we arrived at, because we opened up that conversation, was a zine, a collective zine. I don't have permission to share it, so I don't have it here, but it was a collective zine that they all contributed a page to. And what we arrived at was a zine that was in solidarity with the TAs. So the students kind of reframed their thinking, and as because we were facilitating this conversation, and we reframed it as, how do we become, you know, activists with these, people who are on this labor strike, how do we have this conversation respectfully and kind of express ourselves in solidarity with what they're fighting for? And so they talked about, so I remember one of my students drew panels, like a comic, sharing their personal story and navigating, the complexity of, higher costs of the city and, these kind of underpaid TAs being unfair and unjust. And so all these kind of different stories started interconnecting, and we started kind of exercising this idea of love and respect in the space and in solidarity for what was happening on campus. Now, I could have just said, hey, we're moving on because I have accountabilities to the institution for this funding, but I chose to be accountable to the community and the group that we had formed. I felt that was the important grounding piece for me conceptually, that I could have said, hey, no, we have to do this or else, I'm going to get in trouble. I just thought, hey, like, this is a learning moment and I don't care. Like, this is contributing to their learning. And I can deal with the institution. I know how to talk to the institution about this. So my accountability priority was the community and group. And next time, and anytime now that I think about doing proposals, I always write that very clearly. My accountability is to communities that I'm working with and the groups that I'm working with. It is not to the institution. And that is the whole point of my job. And so I wish I did that, but I didn't. But I ended up going back to the institution, explaining, and they were very understanding in the end. Took a bit of convincing, but eventually they were okay, even though they said, "Oh, you're on thin ice, Sylvia. You shouldn't have been talking about the strike, but we're going to let it go." Um, I like to push the edge a little bit sometimes. Um, and then I like the idea of strengths-based kind of view of different groups and communities, right? Like you want to approach love as a respect, right? So respect means acknowledging the different strengths that that different groups have and what they're doing. And so in this case, when we're talking about the TAs, we were reframing their work as a kind of strength for the students. We're like, they're advocating for their rights, they're advocating for better pay, and so this became like a very like great conversation piece for the students who found it really helpful to unpack. And I love the idea of love being this idea also of imperfection and open to learning. I think there's so much stress around this kind of neoliberal perfectionism where everything is measured so perfectly and we want it to be measured perfectly because there's no room for errors. And if we are to lead a community or lead with community, um, we have to expect that things aren't going to be perfect, and that's okay, that there's always a way forward, or that we can learn and be open to learning when there are mistakes or failures, right? And learning to kind of pause and then, checking in and having conversations and showing that care for one another. So we're at this point where I would love to start theorizing with everyone here. I have a Mentimeter ready to go, which I'm going to show shortly. And the idea is that I want us to kind of collectively talk about what community-led library leadership would mean as a theory. What would it mean for our community? And we can start with concepts. So one of the questions I'll ask is what concepts should exist, right, in this theory? And then the second question I'm going to ask is how are they linked? And how does our theory become practice? So the first question of what concepts should exist or exist in this kind of theory that we're going to build, it's going to be more of a cloud. So it'll bring together the words and concepts that we want to embed into our theory. And then we're going to have an open question where it's just comments of, how does this theory become practice? So how do we turn these concepts into practice? And then we're going to come back a little later and talk about that as well. So I'm going to just set up the Mentimeter here. And so just to let you know, I'm very aware of US data privacy laws. So I use Mentimeter because they follow EU privacy data laws or data privacy laws and legislation. So just I think as like an act of care, I just wanted to make sure that folks know that I don't intend to like I can capture what people want to capture, but you can remain anonymous. I'm not collecting names. It's not for any kind of study. It's just for folks. So we can have an interactive virtual experience. I think the QR code's going to stay on the side there. So why don't we start thinking about what concepts should inform the theory of community-led library leadership? Oh, I love that. Belonging, yes. Mattering.
Sylvia, I think some folks are just seeing your full PowerPoint and not the QR code.
Oh, I apologize. Um, Let me share. Thank you for that. I think after years of doing this, I'd remember. Apologies. Yes. People-centered, yes. Accountability, decolonizing. That's really important in kind of our practice. How are we thinking about that? Anti-capitalist, love it. Yes. Care, empathy, listening, humility. I like deep listening. Yeah, deep listening is very important. How do we show up for the communities that we're working with? Reciprocity, generosity, relationality. Yes, that's really important. Culturally relevant, compassion, justice. Yes. Fairness. Nothing about us. Yes, nothing about us. That's a really good one. Empathy for yourself. Yes. Being kind. Again, moving away from that perfectionist. We don't need to be perfect. We just need to be present, accountable to ourselves, accountable to our communities and groups. Openness, trust. This is very beautiful. We should all turn this into an article. We can have like 100 something authors. Oh, grace. Yes. Addressing systemic issues. Yeah. Community-led means that kind of transformative work, right? Is how do we take our actions and make changes that support community needs rather than problematizing community groups. Gratitude, oh yes, gratitude, reflection. Yep, these are all wonderful, wonderful concepts to include in a kind of theory of community-led library leadership. Vulnerability, transparency, yes. Compassion, I love compassion is there as well. I actually did a presentation yesterday as well. And one of the things I was talking about was pedagogy of care. And we were talking about compassion versus, this idea of like, what does compassion mean when you have very complex, different community groups in a room and you want to show compassion? How do you show up for that? Hope, oh my goodness, yes. Hope, that we always ground ourselves in this idea of hope. Yes, that we're theorizing for hope. This is all so very beautiful. Thank you for sharing, everyone. Okay, so I'm going to let it slow down and then we'll go to the next one. So take a moment and review the word cloud of all these different concepts. And we're going to think about what does this mean in practice? What are the kind of grounding kind of practice that it will show up in your own practice? So we're going to move away from less like essentialist ideas and more towards specifics. Now that we're grounding us in these kind of concepts, what kind of practice are you going to take up when you go back after this conference? How are you going to take what you learned and take these kinds of concepts and this community-led library leadership and what kind of actions will you take? You don't have to give specifics, but just for anonymity, but you can share some ideas. So this is more open response. Crying. Yeah. Tell the truth. Yes. Include more voices. Curiosity. That's a beautiful one. Yes. Showing up. Creating community. Pause to think more about how to respond before responding. Try to be more open towards changes I can't control. Yeah. Outreach, intentionality, sharing stories, listen, create space and pauses and with trusting openness. Again, listen, curiosity, stories, articulate these values at all levels. Let our community actually make decisions. Yeah. Like talking to our community, I mean, what do you want? What can we do? How can we show up? Slow down. Yeah. Slowing down. Being really intentional and thoughtful in our process and building that community. Active listening, slowing down. Authentic conversations. Yes. Oh, I love it. Leaving perfectionist culture. That's one of the things my students often they struggle with is perfectionism and it's so tough because it's tough on everyone and there's no way to move forward because there's always this fear, right? So I love that. Perfectionist culture is so passe. Supporting, collaborating with colleagues, asking big questions and listening carefully to answers. I love that. Being mindful, authenticity. Yeah, just coming as yourself. There's no kind of pretending. It's just you there having conversations. Yeah, I love this. Express that I'm uncertain too, and we'll move through this together. That is one of the most wonderful things to say when you're working with people is I'm also not clear, but I'm here with you and we'll figure it out together. Trying new ways to ask questions. Yeah, that's really good. Community collaboration, challenging assumptions, doing things without thinking about the return on investment. Yes. And that's a challenge, particularly as a manager, you're always having to frame things as what is the value? And sometimes the value is I just want to hang out with cool community folks and do something that's meaningful to them. Oh, play. I love that. I love play. We need more play in the space. We need to take up more of the play pedagogy, more play practice. Yeah, teamwork, being intentional, reflexive, truly listening, oh, this is so beautiful. Joy. Joy is an act of resistance. And so we need to also take that time and space for joy. Joy with our communities and groups, right? It's not just joy within the library world, but how are we connecting with one another in our different groups and experiencing joy? Openness and active listening, leading with curiosity, guidance when things feel hard. Yeah, that will happen. And so how do you how do you kind of ground yourself and go, it's okay, like I can ask for help when things are hard, or talk to different communities and ask for guidance. Yeah, workshopping. Yeah. Like that's the theorizing. How are we going to workshop something, an activity, a service, or program, a new policy? How do we workshop that together? And that's, I think, where a lot more of the community-led practices should be taught in leadership programs. So how can we, you know, work with the community to determine, like, let's say we want to do a more creative exercise and we're going to use photo voice to understand what the needs are, or maybe we're going to do story circles or some form of narrative inquiry, or maybe it is data. And in some cases, in community-led kind of research, sometimes the community wants to see data before they share their stories. So that can be also important. Dreaming, I love that dreaming, inviting and allowing the community to teach us, yeah, that humility piece. Like we don't know everything, that we are also learning along. Open doors, open minds, being fully present. I love all of this. Monotasking, yes, really focusing our time on one thing and really being intentional with that. This is all very beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. Oh, I wish I could show everyone. Failing without fear. Yes. Resting more. Yes. Having good questions, having more patience. Yes. That dialogue. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing, everyone. I love experimentation. That one came up at the last. The experimentation. That's that kind of engagement, right? All right. Let's go back to slide. Thank you so much for engaging in this kind of activity. I know for keynotes it's not really normal, but I love the idea that, theorizing with community is something that's powerful, because then we can all share our insights, ideas, and kind of ground ourselves. Like, what are the kind of concepts we're thinking about in our practice? And then how does that theory become practice, right? And it could be, if you think about it, what we talked a lot of themes were around curiosity and listening. So then we may now, when we go back to our institutions or our universities or our community groups, we may start to kind of go, hey, how are we going to bring in maybe training or learning about a narrative inquiry approach that is really heavy on listening and learning through stories, right? So now kind of moving forward by thinking, how do we put this into practice by looking at the community-led research and work to see where we can bring that into our practice. Okay. So one of the things that I also the kind of drive for this particular talk was this idea of hope. And I like ending on the idea of hope because often some people who've read my work are always like, Sylvia, you're so depressing all the time. Like, why are you so critical of leadership and management? And I always have to say, well, actually, my criticism is kind of a form of hope, because I wouldn't say anything if I didn't have hope. I wouldn't do anything if I didn't have hope. Apathy is when I would just completely give up. And I haven't. And I still talk about this because I have hope that we can always do better, that we are engaged in this. And I think this conference is an exact example of that, that there is hope, that there are people who want to transform what we're doing, to make it inclusive, to hope for something that is going to shift our practice into centering the community. I like this particular quote from Bell Hooks in the teaching community, and this is at the start of the book, and this was what kind of prompted my idea for the talk, was this quote from Bell Hooks, which is, "Hopefulness empowers us to continue our work for justice, even as the forces of injustice may gain greater power for a time." And I want to go back to this idea of the fog. The fog will lift and the fog will go away, and we can only sit in our actions, our thoughts, our values. So when that fog is there, we need our community to come together. We need to stick with our communities, to build those bridges, to form those communities and theorize something forward, even if it's just for a time, only in the act of theorizing. That time for action will come and we'll be ready when we've done that work to connect with our communities. I think that's an important idea to stick with, is that when we link up and we think of community as the center of library leadership, and that should be the grounding of our practice and our values. Here are my references. These are bell hooks text, and I have one. So this particular link to the Tamarack Institute actually outlines different community-led approaches and projects. And I also have my image sources here. Every image here is actually inspired by Bell Hook's collection of poetry, Appalachian Elegy, Poetry and Place. It's a beautiful collection of poems where Bell Hooks sort of laments and reflects on, her ancestral pain, her ancestors and land, and acknowledges the strength and persistence of her people and First Peoples. And really kind of, and this is in the kind of Kentucky kind of area. So all the images are of Kentucky, and one of the images is of I think slides 3 to 4, parallel purple, is Hopkinsonville, Kentucky, where Bell Hooks was born. Thank you so much for your time.
And thank you so much, Sylvia. I hope that you're now seeing the waterfall of emojis that have been coming up throughout this. And, I've been seeing messages throughout. Just what a beautiful, beautiful way to conclude this whole conference. So thank you again, just so, so much. We do have a few questions that are starting to come in, so I'm going to start to go through them. But the one that I think is rising to the top is, I've heard people frame connection with communities and the types of programs you're talking about as competing with the need to keep the library scope manageable for its staff, budget, etc. Do you see those needs as competing, and how do you think about them intersecting?
Ooh, so that's a great question. Competition is something that I think this is my research too. Competition is something that is ingrained in us, right? We are kind of in an institution that trains us to think in this way, right? If you think of like if you do PTR or progression through the ranks, I think they might call it something else in different institutions. We're kind of trained early on to think competitively, like we are against one another, we're held to different values than one another. And I think that's an institutional issue. Now we can think about, and so if we think about critical, I don't know if you've come across, to the person who asked the question, if you come across the work of Critical Hope, I think that's Duncan Andre does this really fantastic article. And sometimes we kind of fall into this hope deferred. We kind of go, oh, it's a system issue, so we can't do anything. It's the system's the problem. And I think it's important that we don't fall into that hopelessness of, we're going to just blame that the system is creating these problems. I think what we can do is kind of think about kind of with the different communities and groups, what it means, like how can we share this space together and how can we work together. I can't share specifics, but I've definitely been in different groups where we have competition for funds and access to funds. And, it's actually quite beautiful when you don't frame the conversation as we have this X amount of funds and now we just got to figure out who deserves it more. That framing immediately, like from my experience, kind of kickstarts a very competitive, like, well, so and so is doing this and I'm doing this and this has more value because we have more people. And then it becomes that kind of framing and that competition is reproduced. I like to kind of approach the conversations as, okay, we have like transparently, we have these funds. This is what the institution's telling me. What can we do so that everyone here can, we can work together to find a way forward? And it's really quite wonderful how honest, when you're honest and truthful in those conversations, how honest and truthful people will be in those conversations in response to that. And they'll say, yeah, I want everyone to benefit from this. So I can, take a bit of a cut here and there. But this is what I'm facing in my, in my department. And then, somebody will kind of chime, oh, you know what? I don't need it this year, but I do need it next year. And so it becomes this, again, it's like this act of trying to have those conversations. This act of theorizing is taking these kind of ideas and thinking like through, like, how can we move forward? And then being transparent in that framing. I don't know if that was helpful, but I hope that helped answer your question.
I think it was, Sylvia, and it echoes what you were saying earlier about how easy it is sometimes to fall into those more sort of capitalistic terms, right? And so that sort of competition, I think, very much falls in line with that. So kind of reframing it instead. So I really appreciate that, as I'm sure that the questioner or question asker did. We have just a few minutes for maybe like a couple more. And so another one that's been upvoted a bit is I've often heard that library budgets are moral documents that represent what priorities are valued the most. How do you think libraries can show that they value community in their budgets? And then somebody said, yes, show me your budget and I'll show you what you value.
I love that. Oh, that's an excellent question. Oh, the budget. I have so many painful stories about the budget. Um, It's something that I teach actually in my leadership course, because students often are kind of like approaching a budget sheet, like they think it's a neutral document. And one thing I teach is like budgets are not neutral. They tell a story. They just tell the story in numbers. And so one of the activities I have them do is I give them the challenge of you've been told to cut 5%, pick something, and I give them a budget spreadsheet. And that usually kind of devolves into complete chaos where the students, because the students are just learning, they're really grounded in their values. They'll go, but I really care about, this community group. I don't want to cut the, certain lines that like will support like this group that's doing activist work. I want to be able to kind of find ways to like move the money around. And so we have these really frank conversations around it. I don't have any kind of experience around successful advocacy, but certainly one thing I've had to do in my own work is um, have conversations with different community groups that I'm supporting and serving in the library with my work and go, okay, like I've got this is the budget, this is the reality. What can we do? What do you think how should we move forward? And what are priorities? Like collectively, what do we think our priorities are? And then also one thing that I always kind of go is like we can always also find money elsewhere too. And so there's always this kind of task of looking for grants and things like that. But I also kind of I like doing that because I like the idea of hope, like maintaining hope, even though I know that there's complications happening in the background with budget cuts. I also like the idea that okay, I'm going to be transparent, but I also like the idea of advocating continually for it, that it's not a conversation that's ended, that this is going to be ongoing, for me at least. So sometimes I know colleagues find me a little persistent about certain things. And my new colleagues do too. So
Great. Thanks so much, Sylvia. We just have a couple minutes. I'm wondering if we might be able to squeeze a quick one in. We'll see. I don't know if I'll pick a quick one, so bear with me here. But someone mentions thank you for inciting so much joy and hope for all of us. Could you recommend methods or mechanisms for gathering insights from our communities and transparent ways of connecting any resulting initiatives from the data they provide while respecting their privacy? Maybe a big question, but there you have it.
ooh, that's an excellent question. Because a lot of the narrative inquiry, kind of the justice piece, that can also be, everybody showing up and in person, and there can be, people may feel like um, not open to sharing in those spaces, or they may the topic itself might be potentially harmful if they were kind of identified. I can think of, if we're thinking about narrative inquiry, I mean, even just focus groups, but like from the framing of community calls and community dialogue is really important. I think often what I like to do is do note taking instead of recording in those spaces. If you're note taking, you're not capturing people's names, but what you do need is a whole team around you who are kind of taking notes, because you need different people to take notes. And then that way you can kind of cross and compare like how what you capture in those meetings or community calls or community dialogue. And so that way you're capturing the information without capturing information about the people, or people's names or identities. And that can be one way to do it. And I've done that before in some studies where I just have to have like a team with you, and you have maybe 2 or 3 note takers, and everybody takes notes and one person facilitates, and then you review the notes, and that way you don't identify anyone. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you again so much, Sylvia. I think, oh, there we go. I'm going to hand it over to Moya to close us out.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Sylvia. If we can show some love and appreciation, you're already doing it. And with your emoji reactions, we're so grateful for your time and your intellectual work and your sharing with us as a community. Lots of messages of hope in the chat, and I hope you feel that through the Zoom screens. Thank you, everyone, for a wonderful fifth COM. As Veronica said, we'll be back in 2028. Please join the listserv to pay attention to anything that goes on in between then, and keep an eye on your inbox for the final evaluation for the conference. We'd love your feedback to make this the best experience possible in the future. Thank you to everyone, and see you in a couple of years.